Prof stream. Tonight we're doing coming back in the new year, 2023, with a new Blacklight reading hour. And I am reading this because I'm teaching it in a class for the first time, which is what I usually do on the stream. So I'm just going to read along, and if anybody pops in, we'll talk about this. But maybe I should preface this for when it goes up on YouTube a little bit later, that this piece is about criticism and why criticism might be valuable or important, even when, or maybe actually when, some kind of bot has appeared in the chat. Thank you. Hello, Spiritual Gun. That's a good name for a bot. Anyway, even when the spirit of the times is maybe not so obviously in step with criticism, that maybe actually because criticism says something other than what needs to be said, to meet the exigence of the moment, to meet this particular rhetorical situation, why it might be for that very reason valuable. So that's what we're going to check out. Wendy Brown is she's pretty well known in certain circles, but without using her reputation, let's just read it and see what we think is going on here. So Spiritual Gun, if you decide to stop slinging Dogecoin and instead do something a little bit more untimely with your time here, you're welcome to join and think about this. Okay. Untimeliness and Punctuality. Critical Theory in Dark Times. It's from a book. So this starts with this epigraph from Roland Barthes. What is criticism? Criticism is not an homage to the truth of the past or to the truth of others. It is a construction of the intelligibility of our own time. And when people use epigraphs, it's hard to kind of say why epigraphs exist, these little quotes that you put at the top of your own writing. I think the gesture is often something like, oh, well, this kind of says, or this is in the spirit of what I'm saying. And having already read this piece, I will say that is helpful to kind of hold and think with as we continue to read. This essay reflects on the timeliness and untimeliness in critical political theory, or on timeliness and untimeliness in critical political theory. Here, so as themes, you might say, and themes of critical political theory. Well, what is that? We don't know. That's okay. It works outside the intellectual circuits through which both problems are conventionally routed. Those offered by Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, and the Frankfurt School. 4 pretty heavy kind of philosophical names there. And again, don't worry about that right now. In order to feature aspects of the relationship between political time and critique, overshadowed by these traditions of thought, Foucault wants to define critique as the art of not being governed quite so much. And these reflections might be taken in the spirit of a refusal to be governed quite so much by critical theory's traditional intellectual signpost. So when criticism, or critical theory, in this case, which he's calling critical theory, becomes part of what governs thinking, then it's time to critique. They accord too with Benjamin's counsel to wrest tradition away from a conformism that is about to overpower it. Wrest tradition away from a conformism. I think that for many people, for us, when we think about tradition, we tend to think about something that's extreme, already conforming. How could tradition not be conformist? And I think that's a good kind of question to think with in throughout this whole piece, and maybe even beyond it. One way you might think about a tradition is a kind of organizing of the past that you put into your perception. Or another way you could think about it is you're kind of adopting your own ancestors. We're doing families backwards in time. But anyway, arresting Benjamin thought could be enabled through igniting images of the past, different from those the present routinely paints for or as itself. So, what we get from history or from our imagination of the past is often a kind of often serves a kind of story about ourselves in the present moment. Even at the moment where we say, I hate history, it's so boring. Or history, it just doesn't have much for me. That very image of history that goes along with that might be the one that kind of serves somebody else, not necessarily you who are feeling that, somebody else. Maybe not somebody else, like a specific individual, but okay. We begin with 3 tales from contemporary political life, each of which poses a conundrum for the time of critique. The Geneva Accords, an unofficial framework for a peace settlement between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, were signed amid much fanfare by selected Palestinian and Israeli representatives in December 2003. Designed to model what the people wanted and could agree on, as opposed to what intransigent official leadership would do, and to represent a replacement of either of earlier negotiation processes, including the Oslo Accords. These were, that was an earlier attempt at agreement. The Geneva Accords mapped in considerable detail a contemporary 2-state solution to the enduring bloody conflict in the Middle East. By the way, if you're here, feel free to put anything in the chat. It doesn't even have to be something like totally related to what's going on right now. Whatever you're thinking about, it's very welcome here. So you're welcome to say whatever you like. Both committed Zionists and Palestinian militants rejected the Geneva Accords as selling out their interests. Ariel Sharon condemned the document out of hand, and even Labor Prime Party Minister Ehud Barak heaped scorn on it. Those are both on the Israeli side. Most Palestinian organizations also rejected it. In addition, many progressives committed to a just peace in the Middle East viewed the accords as representing compromises of Palestinian aspirations and entitlements too great to swallow. They largely gave up the Palestinian right of return, leaving the matter for Israel alone to determine. So the right of return refers to, it refers to many different things at this point, but in 1948, what Palestinians call the Nakba, or the disaster, in which, in the founding of Israel as a state, many Palestinians were exiled. Many live now in Jordan. And so the diasporic Palestinian community has often, and their allies have argued for the right of return, that in whatever kind of, whether it's a 2-state solution or something else, one of the rights that should be guaranteed to Palestinian people is the right to return back to Palestine that are in exile. This has not ever been gotten in any agreement, not even close, that has been agreed to. In addition, for many committed Democrats, the time of the 2-state solution, if it has ever existed, had passed, for practical as well as principled reasons. Such critics argued that the aspiration for democracy and peace in the Middle East required a reckoning with the anti-democratic heart of a Zionist state that is also a colonial one, and insisted on the importance of formulating a binational state that would harbor Palestinians and Jews on a one-person, one-vote basis. So that would be what sometimes people call a one-state solution, or a binational state, another way of putting it. Critics in this last group were themselves harshly condemned by supporters of the Geneva Accords. In essence, the condemnation ran, "You are holding out for utopia while we are modeling real-world solutions. If you truly care about peace in the Middle East, then you must support the Accords. If you do not support them, you care more about your abstract ideals than about politics." Now notice, she's quoting someone here and doesn't cite them. Plagiarism. But actually, she's not quoting anyone. She's apostrophizing. She's inventing a kind of position and a voice that someone might typically speak through. And this is why she says, in essence, this is what it sounded like. And then she ends there, because this whole thing is just one example, and we're going to go into the second one, of a certain kind of contemporary political crisis, and how a kind of critical moment in that is refused. Number 2. Once John Kerry emerged as the clear nominee of the Democratic Party for the 2004 presidential elections, Ralph Nader threw his hat into the ring. While delighting Republicans, Nader's move infuriated most liberals and leftists, including many who had voted for Nader in 2000. "Anybody but Bush," was the cry of the day, which meant that every voter had to line up behind the emerging Democratic Party nominee, whatever one's misgivings about him. Nader was a selfish spoiler, fit for nothing more than denunciation. this is kind of maybe more recently than when this was written, would be there was a lot of anger and animosity towards Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, in the 2016 election when she ran, because people thought that she gave the election to Trump or things like that. Susan Sarandon was involved in some of the animosity, so a similar kind of argument and feeling was happening around Ralph Nader. A few small voices, however, suggested that Nader was doing what he has always done, namely working publicly to remind America that obscenely gerrymandered political districts. So if you're not from the United States, this word gerrymandered is specific to American politics, and it means that the way that a political voting district is drawn and it's drawn by people in political parties, favors numerically their own party in a bunch of different complicated ways. So it's kind of like corruption, political corruption, but there's nothing against it. Like it's not illegal to do it. In fact, we don't know any other way to do it, apparently. And two corporately financed political parties do not a democracy make. What was the harm of this reminder when Nader knows full well that we all, perhaps even Nader himself, would vote for Kerry in November? And if not during the election season, when else could this point be made as powerfully and vividly? So people would be like, why are you doing this now? Just like, let's get through this election and then we'll have the conversation. And so she's asking here, like, well, when would that time be? What if Nader's candidacy were to make Kerry even slightly more accountable to the citizenry and less beholden to corporate interests? Above all, what if Nader's candidacy, based largely on a critique of the corrupt and anti-democratic aspects of the existing electoral and party system, became a way to infiltrate the media lockout of such critique? Media lockout here just meaning the media doesn't cover this kind of stuff. Be like, let's talk about it later. It's like, yeah, when? Well, when am I going to get on TV? In a presidential election cycle, there's lots of cameras around, lots of reporting on things. It's something, right? So that's kind of what she's arguing, I think. Number 3. In early January 2004, recently elected Mayor Gavin Newsom, recently elected? Okay, here we go, of San Francisco declared that the city would commence granting marriage licenses to same-sex partners. In the ensuing weeks, as thousands of lesbian and gay couples descended on San Francisco's City Hall, other cities in California and New York, New Jersey, and Oregon jumped on the bandwagon. Suddenly, gay marriage was the civil rights issue of the day. The marriages themselves were compared by liberal pundits to the bus and lunch counter boycotts of the Black Civil Rights Movement. The New York Times gave gay marriage a ringing endorsement, and along with scores of other American newspapers and magazines, carried joyous pictures and stories of gay couples tying the knot. When after 4 weeks the California Supreme Court ruled against Newsom's initiative and halted San Francisco's issuance of marriage licenses to same-sex couples, San Francisco's gay district, the Castro, exploded. Under the slogan, "We demand the equal right to marry," demonstrators rallied and chanted through the night. Meanwhile, those who were dubious about either egalitarian or emancipatory aspects of the right to marry, whether from feminist, queer, left, or anti-statist perspectives, notably she's not including the homophobic perspectives here, right? Were largely reduced to silence. So much as mentioning that marriage has functioned historically to secure women's subordination and male privilege, to hoard wealth and transmit property, and to regulate sexuality, ethnicity, race, class, and nation, was tantamount to throwing dirt in the punch bowl. Hey, we finally are celebrating here. Why are you such a spoilsport? Just as unmentionable is the fact that as a state and religiously granted status, marriage itself buttresses the intermingled power and authority of church and state, which together secure and regulate marriage as the legitimate modality for love, for sex, and for child-rearing. Equally unspeakable was the suggestion that gays and lesbians promulgating marriage as the ultimate sanctification of love between two people were biting from the same mytho-historical muffin. That's a nice phrase. Mytho-historical muffin as anti-gay conservatives declaring marriage to be timeless and transcendent in meaning. If this was a civil rights battle, there was no room to cast doubt or aspersion on the value or the meaning of the right being fought for. So it'd be like, no. We can't talk about whether this is valuable or about how the value might work. That's not what we're talking about. Marriage must be won as a right. It is therefore hardly surprising that when a threesome unsuccessfully sought a marriage license from San Francisco city officials, they were jeered by their fellow queers. "You're ruining it for all of us," yelled the wedding-besotted crowd as the triplet of sexual deviants walked away from the courthouse. Again, a kind of apostrophe of a group perspective. So, despite the variation in their political significance, these three political episodes feature a common conservative and moralizing rejection of critique as untimely. It might be worth saying a word about moralizing. It's different to say that something is moral to say that something is moralizing. Moralizing almost always has a negative connotation to it. And it's the kind of act of simplifying and reducing things into moral terms, which fails to understand them as more complex phenomena. That the moral vocabulary doesn't sustain our understanding of everything that we need to know about something. That's one way you might understand what she's trying to say there. It is not the time, declare the workers in the political trenches to the critics, a retort that invokes time in the triple sense of 1, the timing relevant to successful political campaigns. The election is not the time, not an election year. There's a lot of election years, at least in this country, so it's pretty much always an election year. 2, the constrained or dark political times we feel ourselves to be in. It's these are bad times. You're being utopian. You're hoping for too much. You're complaining about that when climate change is on the agenda. And 3, appropriateness, mannerliness, or civility. Timeliness as temperateness about when, how, and where one raises issues or mentions certain problems. This is not the time and the place for this kind of conversation. The first sense is concerned with, I'll say, I don't think I've ever talked about this before, and I don't want to say too much about it, but I did once do a kind of a very uncivil protest, just me and another person, that was around someone who was let's say a defense intellectual, and he was being kind of feted by the university and brought in to speak. And the protest was very simple. It was simply to hold up his own words while he spoke. Words that he had written about something else. Okay. But it happened to be the memorial, it was a memorial luncheon for someone who I don't know. And his family was there. And we had a little bit of a conversation between the two of us about should we still do it because it's a memorial luncheon? I was like, it's always a memorial luncheon. It's always an honor if somebody's life or career these speeches are given. Isn't that part of the protection for this kind of speech, that it's always made elevated and appropriate so that what this person might really stand for, which might be something if we more or less civilly would call warmongering, it's a protection against that sometimes. The first sense is concerned with strategy and efficiency in reaching a defined political end. The second speaks to holding back the dark, and the third invokes maturity and propriety against infantilism or indecorousness. Critique is taken to be, at best, irrelevant, at worst, damaging to the value represented by each. You're really hurting your own position. The rebuff of critical theory as untimely provides the core matter of the affirmative case for it. Critical theory is essential in dark times, not for the sake of sustaining utopian hopes, making flamboyant interventions, or staging irreverent protests, but rather to contest the very senses of time invoked to declare critique untimely. So it's kind of recursive. This is where it starts to get maybe a little bit more complicated. And Wendy Brown is trying to get us to work against the grain of our intuitions here already, where when people are like, this is not the time, be like, yes, exactly. This is not the time. And that's why we're trying to change what the time is. Change our sense of time. If the charge of untimeliness inevitably also fixes time, then disrupting this fixity is crucial to keeping the times from closing in on us. It is a way of reclaiming the present from the conservative hold on it that is borne by the charge of untimeliness. To insist on the value of untimely political critique is not then to refuse the problem of time, or to be like, no, this is always true, this is eternal, I speak for human rights, it's always valuable. Be like, wait a minute, is human rights, when did that discourse start? It's kind of pretty 20th century, actually. Or timing in politics, but rather to contest settled accounts of what time it is. what the times are, and what political tempo and temporality we should hew to in political life. Untimeliness deployed as an effective intellectual and political strategy, far from being a gesture of indifference to time, is a bid to reset time. Intellectual and political strategies of successful untimeliness therefore depend on a close engagement with time in every sense of the word. They are concerned with timing and tempo. They involve efforts to grasp the times by thinking against the times. They attempt, as Nietzsche put it, to overcome the present by puncturing the present's overvaluation of itself. An overcoming whose aim is to breathe a new possibility into the age. You might critique the present moment. I have to say, there is a kind of position where someone's like, oh, it's very crotchety it's very old-fashioned. I had a conversation with a good friend the other night, and he was like, I don't want to go too into it and to give out personal details, but he was reminding me of something I had said once, that he was like, it helped him figure something out, but it had something to do with where I was talking about like today's popular culture, as if it wasn't just everything. I was like, yeah, in today's popular culture, I don't know, that was kind of what the point was. I was like, in today's popular culture, something. And just making that distinction was like, oh. For him, it was like a little bit of a sting at first, but it helped him later. But he was also like, but the stuff that you thought was important, he's like, that's gone away. And I was like, well, maybe. It's kind of always possible for things to maybe return. Things from the past to kind of come back at you. The return of the repressed, the revenant. But they're not going to do them by themselves. It's kind of the job of the critic to be like, are we sure we have everything we need for our trip here? And also, by the way, where are we going? So an overcoming whose aim is to breathe a new possibility into the age. If our times are dark, what could be more important? Critical theory. To make the argument for critical theory as a hope rather than a luxury in dark times, we will need to think first a bit about critique, then about political time, and then about their relation. So she's telling you what she wants you to do, rather than being like, oh yeah, you went to college. You got to get all upset about these things. I got to pay the bills. That might be an attitude that you hear. Or it might be something more like, I literally heard this argument today between a young woman and man who were both working somewhere at the door of a restaurant, this kind of restaurant thing. And she was extremely engaged in trying to kind of prove to him the evils of capitalism and the carceral state. And he was asking, I think, very, kind of like honest and open questions. He wasn't really convinced by what she had to say. And she was like, I just care too much to talk about these things. Because she could kind of feel that there was something about her position or how she was representing it or this is the sense I got, that it didn't fully match what she wanted to say. It wasn't that he was really like poking a lot of holes in it. She in her own sense of it was like, this is not fitting. And so she had to kind of like defer it to another time. A time where it wasn't going to be so pressing. But like, where would that time come from? Critique is an old term that derives from the Greek crisis. As the term flowered in modernity, and indeed with Kant came in part to define modernity, this connection between crisis and critique has been partly sustained, partly cast off. Again, so we don't really, these little moments when you see that it's in these brackets, you can be like, I can just ignore that. I'll just give you a very basic sense of what I think she means by this. With Kant, it came in part to define modernity. Kant famously wrote 3 critiques, which in German you still spell with the K. And these 3 critiques, in some sense, some people were arguing, this is in the kind of late 18th century, gave a kind of philosophical articulation to almost like the scientific subject, you could say, of like what it would mean for us to kind of be modern subjects that understand that the world is made not from our own ideas about it, but that our own ideas are necessary to access it. Okay, it's pretty complicated stuff. In ancient Athens, crisis was a jurisprudential term identified with the art of making decisions, an art considered essential to judging and rectifying an alleged disorder in or of the democracy. In contrast to contemporary concerns with distinguishing the two, in its original usage, critique is an explicit project of judgment. Since in Athenian democracy, a defendant who has a citizen and Senate member and the subset of the Senate constituting the jury also judged and sentenced the defendant. Crisis referred to a scene in which the object, agent, process, and result of critique were intermingled. Procedurally, juridical crisis thus consisted of recognizing an objective crisis and convening subjective critics, who then passed a critical judgment and provided a formula for restorative action. So she's really, this sentence seems like you might be like, wow, that sentence is overlong and overcomplicated. But here you can see what she's trying to do is almost give you like a formula for all of the terms, all of the variables that she wants to think with. So if in the regular kind of form of judgment, when we're in a law court, it's very clear, this is the defendant, this is the accuser, I am the jury. They didn't really have a judge in the ancient courts, but we might say there's the judge, whatever it is. But there was also this other kind of process that was related to justice as a state institution, but which wasn't just kind of the normal law court. There really wasn't as much of a normal law procedure in ancient Athens, it turns out. But anyway, be like, well, we need to do something. What are we going to do? What is the case? Rather than the case appears in the court and you're like ready to go. It's like, what is the case? What happens when that occurs? Today, we don't have like an institution for that, except the media maybe. Or you could say criticism itself. Socratic critique converges with this practice in its dialectical and dialogical aspect, but breaks with it as it replaces an adjudicated truth, that is, this is what we say is the case, with the search for a philosophical one, when he's like, but what is justice? And he's kind of going around talking to various people. Socrates, this little character. Going around Athens, bothering people. With the latter move, Socratic critique itself becomes a critique of the originally democratic and holistic form of crisis. So she's kind of like, she's not necessarily saying like, yes, like Socrates. She's like, no. Socrates is doing a different thing than crisis was. Embodied in the Republic and literalized in Socrates' defense at his trial, the form, content, aim, and venue of Socratic philosophy is a critique of Athenian critique, and as such, of Athenian democracy. And that wouldn't be too controversial. If you read a lot of Plato, you get the sense that he wasn't a huge fan of democracy. There might be a couple things worse than democracy, like tyranny, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close to tyranny in Plato's works. And that's mostly where we know Socrates from. The sifting and sorting entailed in Greek crisis focused on distinguishing the true from the false, the genuine from the spurious, the beautiful from the ugly, and the right from the wrong, distinctions that involved weighing pros and cons of particular arguments. That is, evaluating and adjudging evidence, reasons, or reasoning. Crisis thus comes close to what we would today call deliberation, and its connotations are quite remote from either negativity or scholasticism. So I'm going to stop here and just be like, what's going on here? Why is she going here? She gave us these kind of 3 moments earlier, and now we're in this kind of ancient Greek thing. And she told us, let's just go back and say what she's doing here. She's like, well, oh wait, I went too far. She's like, first, to make the argument for critical theory as a hope rather than a luxury in dark times, we need to think a bit about critique than political time and their relation. So we're still thinking just like, what about critique? Like, what is critique? One of the things that many people think critique is, they're like, well, critique is something that I do as an individual. I am a critic. I go around and I critique. Or, maybe even more likely, critique is something that other people do that are critics that I never do. Why would I do it? I'm nice. I'm not judgy. But she's like, actually, the beginning is a collective moment where people will come together and say, there's something wrong in our city, in the place that we live. There's something wrong here. What is it? We need to argue about what it is first together. So she's saying that the kind of more original version of critique is like deliberation. When we have political deliberation today, if you're in a kind of country that has a parliamentary process, if you're in the United States, I mean, It's not really even a parliamentary process. Congress has debates, but really people just get up and give a speech about the position that they've already decided to. No one's really changing their minds in these parliamentary sessions. Okay, I mean, maybe some people think that they are. I don't know. I find that very hard to believe. They're there kind of representing their positions to the media, and then maybe to their constituents or whatever, but they're not there to kind of openly argue and figure it out in the moment. That's already all happened. But what if there was a place where we'd be like, what are we going to do? That's maybe more closer to what she's imagining crisis was like. Since this practice also has a restorative aim in relation to the literal crisis provoking it, crisis is also the thing that makes us kind of come together and be like, oh God, what are we going to do? Like an emergency, like a natural disaster might be closer to what we're imagining. There could be no such thing as mere critique, indulgent critique, or even untimely critique. Rather, the project of critique is set the times right again by discerning and repairing a tear in justice through practices that are themselves exemplary of justice that has been rent. Again, this complex origin is evident in the way the project of philosophical critique takes shape for Socrates. Socratic critique was born of a monumental crisis, responding to the Peloponnesian War, the catastrophe of the Peloponnesian War, which resulted not simply in a lost empire, but in a profoundly degraded, corrupted, and disoriented democracy. Now, the Peloponnesian War is this, Thucydides writes about it, it's this war between Sparta and Athens, but not really just two cities, they're kind of two emergent empires, and lots of people get involved, and it was a pretty big thing in this period of ancient history in this part of the world. In this context, Socrates conceived the task of critique in keeping with the conceptual lines of the original crisis, to sort, sift, and set the times to rights. But he made Athenian conceptions and practices of justice themselves the object of critique. He worked to remove from the hands of the demos the process of sorting and judging entailed in critique. So he was like, who are you to say this? He's like, well, what do you know? That was his question always, to be like, what do you know? Who are the experts on justice? Where can we find them? He doesn't find any, but for him that means, well, you shouldn't be judging. It doesn't mean that maybe there are no experts on judging. Reconceived by Socrates as a philosophical activity, both deriving from and producing individual virtue, even critique that involved discerning the nature of political justice was hived off from the political juridical domain. This hiving off is explicitly expressed and defended in the Apology when Socrates explains his limited participation in Athenian political life, by pointing out the impossibility of pursuing critique, and hence virtue there. It's like, well, if I were actually doing, anyway. Thus, critique loses its jurisprudential and political status and comes to be constituted as viable only at a certain remove from political life. It's when you're at the kind of party, you're at the drinking party, and you kind of play it as a philosophical game. That's the moment when you do critique. It's not in the moment of like things really happening. Paradoxically, Socrates depicts critique both as inherently marginalized and neutered by politics, if it refuses this remove, and yet is politically potent if it can ascertain the right degree of remove. So it's more powerful when it's kind of not at the center of politics. If Alcibiades, who's one of his kind of like boys he's trying to work with and help with, becomes a general, and he does, well, then the game's over. He's learned all the wrong lessons. There's really no hope for him. Socrates responds to the collapse of Athenian holism, then, by ontologically separating the domains of politics and critical theory, at which point critical theory becomes, and has been ever after, a gadfly. Etymologically, after antiquity, criticism and critique move apart from crisis, save for a certain sustained connection in the field of medicine. A usage that, according to Reinhard Koselleck, developed in Latin in the Middle Ages to designate the crucial stage of a disease in which a decision had to be made but had not yet been reached. Crisis and criticism as demand for judgment remain closely intertwined here, as indicated by the contemporary medical designation critical condition. Someone's in critical condition, could go either way. They could die. They could live. So it's not hospice. It's not inpatient. Well, it is inpatient, but you know what I mean. Tellingly, we do not speak of not outpatient, let's say. It's easier. Tellingly, we do not speak of the condition of someone mortally wounded or dying alone or among lay persons as critical. Rather, this terminology is reserved for the dangerously ill within a medical facility. It's kind of an interesting observation. When someone's like gets really hurt, you don't be like, oh my gosh, they're critically injured. That sounds medical, right? She's like, well, that's part of the meaning of it, is that it's reserved for that place, that institution, those people. Indicating that accurate diagnosis and judgments about appropriate interventions potentially stand between life and death. This meaning lingers in political crisis as well. When we call a threshold moment in an international standoff, in negotiations, or in a campaign critical, we signal the need for accurate assessment and effective strategies of action, all in a context designated as urgent. Designated doesn't mean it really is urgent. I mean, how would we know what it is? What is urgent or not? That's part of the argument, isn't it? A critical condition is thus a particular kind of call, an urgent call for knowledge, deliberation, judgment, and action to stave off catastrophe. What is interesting in this contemporary trace of the old usage is the sustained linking of the objective and subjective dimensions of critique. The ways in which a worldly event or phenomenon, whether a collapsed empire or a diseased body, connects a specific condition with an immediate need to comprehend by sifting, sorting, or separating its elements, to judge and to respond to it. Also noteworthy is the way that critique is linked to temporal rupture and repair. Critique as political crisis promises to restore, and notice she's spelling crisis here in the other way, that way that imagines us kind of convening to figure out what is going on. What are we to do, to really deliberate? Critique as political crisis promises to restore continuity by repairing or renewing the justice that gives an order the prospect of continuity, that indeed makes it continuous. This quality of urgency, this depiction of critique as non-optional in the restoration of an organism's or polity's health, so medically or politically, continues through Kant's account of the imperative of critique in establishing the moral autonomy and hence freedom of the subject. So in the second critique, Kant's second critique, he talks about, he sets forward an idea about what ends up being called the categorical imperative. That I'm going to put forward any action that I have, the maximum of that action, if it's universalizable, then it's within moral reason. But he begins this kind of whole long, complicated argument about what is moral and what is not, from the position that we cannot just begin with any random premises. You can't begin from a religious position, even though he was himself a religious person. So we have to kind of discover our freedom in what binds us to ourselves, our autonomy. We give rules to ourselves rationally through our action, because if we took our rules for our action as being something that's only for us, then we wouldn't be treating it as a rule. It would be irrational. Okay. I don't think she agrees with that, neither do I. And through Marx's turn of this imperative to establishing the conditions for collective human freedom. So Marx writes, a lot of what Marx writes you could say is critical. There's a critique. He writes specifically something called a critique of the Gotha program. A lot of what he wrote was criticism of other socialists, how other people imagined how we could get to a world in which we wouldn't have classes, we wouldn't have a class structure or something like that. Attunement to this lineage provides a counterpoint to contemporary characterizations of critique as disinterested, distanced, negating, or academic. It's kind of, the black turtleneck, an unlit pipe kind of thing. Very interesting. It also counters the distinctly modern presumption of critique's dependency on and involvement with transcendent truth. Which you could say of both Kant and Marx, of saying, I guess maybe not transcendent for Marx, but this idea of the point of criticism is to show what is true. We discover the truth that's behind all of the things. But if it comes from crisis, with that K sense, it's up to us to figure out what is the case. Nobody else can do it. There's no other thing to discover other than what we decide ourselves. But we deliberate ourselves. Okay, political time. So she's going through these three terms. We did critique. I don't know, it's kind of unsettling, kind of more confusing now after that. Political time. This intentionally partial exercise in etymological, this means the kind of origins of the word. Someone was saying the other day, because we were talking in class and I was doing this thing where I was pretending to get really angry at everyone for looking at dictionaries, because we were talking about like what things mean or what we saw and stuff. And everyone turns to the dictionary. This is a very common thing. I've been teaching long enough that, it's because I just kind of expect it to happen. And I was like, well, what do lexicographers, people who write dictionaries, look at? And someone was like, well, they look at the etymology of words, which is true. They look at the kind of Latin or Sanskrit or Persian or Greek roots of the word. They kind of tell you the history of how a word develops. In good dictionaries, they will do this. That's not the meaning of the word, though, because what that shows you is how the meaning of the word changed. If anything, the etymology, I like etymology a lot, but I like etymology almost for the opposite reason then, that it tells you what something means. It shows you an image in what you mean that is different than what you normally would think about. So it forces you to sometimes deal with a different meaning, even within the meaning you're already using. Okay. If I do an example of it, maybe that would have helped, but I can't think of one right now. Okay. This intentionally partial exercise in etymological memoration, of what critique means through crisis, through all the different things that it meant in medicine and law, right? She just give us the example. Suggests certain ways in which the practice of critical theory inherently invokes a set of concerns with time. The crisis that incites critique and that critique engages itself signals a rupture of temporal continuity, which is at the same time a rupture in a political imaginary, a rupture in a collective self-understanding or dependent on the continuity of certain practices. Or as Derrida has taught us to read a line from Shakespeare, for a polity suffering an internal crisis where justice is ruptured, the time is out of joint. This is something that Hamlet says. Here, Derrida is riffing on the line from Hamlet. The time is out of joint. Time is disarticulated, dislocated, dislodged. Time is run down, on the run and run down. Deranged, both out of order and mad. Time is off its hinges. Time is off course, beside itself, disadjusted. Personally, I don't feel like this quote adds much. I think I know why she's kind of doing it. Here, it doesn't really give me much more than what she said. But here's what I'd say about it. You know that feeling that time is out of joint? In Hamlet, do you ever get the feeling that you're like, the vibe is off? But it's not because you walk into a room or you're looking at anything. It's just in general, the vibe is off. Something is off. Something is rotten in Denmark or Boston or Mumbai. That's kind of what she's talking about, I think. That feeling that the time is out of joint. A polity in crisis is living out of its time. Disynchronic. In crisis, the age is dishonored, consequent to what Derrida terms a rupture, and decay is conjoining power. Decay is Greek for justice. Why does she go back to the Greek here? Probably because she wants us to hear it with a slightly different meaning than what we would normally mean it, but we may not be able to access that if we haven't been spending a lot of time thinking about Greek systems of justice or something. So when a polity is in crisis, the times are unhinged, running off course. Time itself lacks its capacity to contain us and conjoin us. So you might start being like, well, she's talking about time, but doesn't time, aren't just it goes day, week, month, what's she talking about? Obviously, she's not a theory about how clocks work. So what does she mean by time? You kind of have to accept that she has something important to say, that for her, time is the best word to say it. Our sense of time, or the time in which we live, isn't actually the sense of clock time. We all know that, right? It kind of comes in and out. But I think it's closer to this question of what time are we in now? What time is it? We might do it at a kind of daily level. Be like, oh, it's dinner time. Oh, and somebody be like, oh, no, it's not for me. Dinner time for me is later. You're like, oh, okay, we have different dinner times. And even in that kind of quotidian sense of time where time can be mapped onto a clock, we still make those kinds of distinctions. It's business time. I'm going to go into that mode. It's that kind of time. But we have all sorts of conversations about like, well, what kind of time is it now? What's time to do certain things, to act and be and feel in certain ways? The meaning of our time. And that sets up lots of arguments for people to say, well, it's not time for that. Or it's time for this. We all need to adopt. It's time for education to get with the real world. Here's an argument you hear sometimes. Time for education to get with the real world. Enough of this liberal arts stuff. We need STEM education. That is where the times are going. We need things to be technological and fast. I don't necessarily disagree with that wholesale, that attitude. But the way that attitude gets set up is through an understanding of our time as being a time that is technological, fast, that needs to be caught up with. The time is beyond us. Well, where does that idea come from? That's not necessarily coming from a critical sense of time, but from maybe posing a crisis. There's a crisis in education. And education has to catch up with the time, something like that. So critique is going to say, or critique can say, what it can do is say, well, wait a minute, what time is it actually? How do we know? How do we go and make that judgment? Critique's relation to crisis thus turns us toward the problem of political time, a time that is like no other time and incessantly morphs in meaning from tempo to temporality, to periodicity to world condition. So tempo, like the rhythm, up to the, what's the name of the age, right? Lots of different scopes of that kind of meaningful time. As with critique, it will be useful to juxtapose some formulations of specifically political time. Machiavelli figured political time as both beyond human control. The movement of events always has fortuna's hand in it, fortune, fate. Well, maybe more fortune is better there. And as that element which every political virtuoso shapes to his own ends so as to triumph over fortuna. And here she's playing off of, in Machiavelli's Italian, he kind of names these as the two principles, famously in The Prince, virtu and fortuna, that you need virtu politically to be a kind of like good political actor, precisely because fortuna is going to kind of always outpace you. So you need to be able to kind of respond. And so he changes the meaning of virtue from maybe like a more Christian sense that would have been a lot more popular at the time, of being like good and nice and kind and loving. At least it's what you're supposed to be. To being like virtuosic, being like, I know how to use violence and deception and charm and sex appeal, whatever it is, to mantenere lo stato, to maintain my position, maintain the position, maintain the state also at the same time. While fortuna signifies the extra-human movement of political time, Machiavelli also conceived political time and political space as a wholly theatrical production, to be fashioned and fabricated as a political weapon. One of the more famous stories from The Prince concerns this guy who, Cesare Borgia, who had sent out to the place that he had subdued, a city he had subdued, a very harsh administrator. And the administrator came in and kind of like did all these purges and like enforced these kinds of harsh laws and stuff on the people that were there. Then when he came back, Borgia murders that guy, decapitates him, and puts his head in the public square, and then throws a big carnival. And so now he's liberated people from the violence that he himself imposed on them, but they don't see it that way because they simply see the spectacle around them. And they're like, oh yes, you are a liberator. For Machiavelli, the construction of political time was importantly psychological in its effect, capable of producing different responses: panic, fear, boldness, lassitude, according to the seeming imminence or remoteness of a danger or possibility. And that really kind of goes back to lots of ancient rhetorical conceptions about fear. Fear, says Aristotle in Rhetoric, causes us to deliberate. Fear makes things feel closer to us. It's coming. William Connolly, drawing on Paul Virilio, emphasizes the phenomenon of speed as one of the most important features of late modernity. For Connolly, we're in the age of speed. Speed, not like the movie, but that too, which we had best catch up to if we are to be effective Democrats. Sheldon Wallen argues that such catching up indeed argues for a deliberate resistance on the part of radical Democrats to the forced speed up of the political workplace. So there's an argument here that's happening. Some people are like, get with the times. We got to go faster, to achieve our political ends. All of these people are all on the political left. Nevertheless, they all disagree with each other about what our response to time should be. Should we go fast, or should we actually try to slow things down? Wallen argues this resistance because political time, which he equates with democratic time, is necessarily slow. Slower than anything else in late modern life. Political time is slower than anything else. It requires an element of leisure, in the sense of a leisurely pace. Welcome to the Rhetoric Prof stream. What's your rush? You ever notice how people keep editing out the breaths that they take in videos that they post? This is owing to the needs of political action to be preceded by deliberation. Well, if we read that really fast, we might misunderstand it. We might think that's referring almost to like a procedural thing that would happen in the Congress. Before we pass the bill, we need to have the debate. Everyone come out and read your position papers that you're already decided. It's not what they're talking about. If it's going to be political action, it has to be preceded by deliberation. If there's no deliberation, it's not action, it's decision. So there's a distinction being drawn here. Political action, the condition for action, is that moment of deliberation, is that space for it. Political time is also conditioned by the presence of differences and the attempt to negotiate them. It's complex. There's not just one thing happening. Without the possibility of deliberation and negotiation, and of the leisureliness that affords them, the conditions for democracy are literally eviscerated. I wonder why she used a literally there, because eviscerated means your guts come out, but maybe that's what she means. This suggests that the political as the democratic is terribly endangered in our time. So one of the weird things that she's kind of pointing to, she's like, democracy might no longer be political in this sense. Because everybody's just coming out on Congress floor and they're just reading their prearranged speeches. And they're not really deliberating. That's democracy as a kind of bureaucratic form. It's like a techno-bureaucratic form. It's not political. So she's kind of getting you to try to see a different sense of these terms than you might normally do. And you might struggle and not be persuaded at first. That's okay. That's totally good. But just be like, well, maybe she doesn't miss the thing that I think. Maybe she sees that too and she's trying to say something else. Connolly regards Wallen's conclusion as an understandable but ultimately unacceptable nostalgia for a different, slower age. You're just trying to go back to those good old days. It's not going to happen. If the tempo of late modernity is largely driven by political, economic, and cultural forces, Connolly asks, hadn't we best locate or fashion democratic practices that can keep or counter the beat? Otherwise, you'll become like those Polish generals who were using horses and lances against tanks. One of these examples people always go to. Frederick Jameson diagnoses postmodernity. She's doing something that I'm going to tell my students not to do, which is like, don't start paragraphs with just naming somebody else. Like, say what the paragraph is about first. Now, I think that she feels comfortable doing that, and maybe is justified in doing that, because for her audience, these names are very familiar. Frederick Jameson would be very familiar to probably anybody who is reading this essay without it being assigned to them. And so it kind of is the topic sentence. But in most cases, it's probably not the best thing to do. And I think even here, I'm like, come on, Wendy. What do you want to say first? Frederick Jameson diagnoses postmodernity as a condition in which time consists in an eternal present and much further away, an inevitable catastrophe. These two moments showing up distinctly on the registering apparatus without overlapping or transitional states. So it's like, here we are. So, I mean, one of the arguments that Jameson is constantly on about is this argument made that after 1989, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had arrived at the end of history. So this is an argument made by this guy, Francis Fukuyama. And he was like, this is the end of history because like basically everything that's going to happen now is all going to happen as part of like a liberal Western capitalist world system. There might be a few holdouts here or there. There's still Cuba, or there's still little things. But basically, the whole world is in one global economy. It's kind of globalized world. His argument was not unsophisticated. He had a lot to say. But Jameson wanted to say like, okay, well, this is the new ideology. This is the ideology: is that we are out of history somehow now, that there are no more struggles to have, because the struggle between communism and capitalism, as we understood it, ended, or as many people understood. It is the next instant of time that falls out. We are like people only able to remember their distant pasts, who have lost this whole dimension of the recent and most familiar. It's kind of sad for me today to read that line. But that is kind of the condition, of many people today, very literally, people who suffer from Alzheimer's and certain forms of dementia, where we say that they lose their memory. But in some sense, they kind of live in their memory, a memory of a more distant past that becomes to them much more familiar. They may mistake you, your grandmother or grandfather may mistake you for a friend that of theirs that they knew when they were 15. And he's like, we're all like that. We're all living in the distant past. We think that we're kind of living this very contemporary moment, but actually, we're treating everything like it's all part of this thing that's been around forever. But like, oh yeah, all this makes sense. All of these institutions in our lives, like these are things that are like there by nature. All of this stuff, the history of these things, like doesn't register. That actually means that it's less present to us. Be like, isn't it kind of weird that credit scores, like you have a credit score, you just kind of have one? Like that was a really recent invention. Really recent. Or isn't it kind of weird that like you have to show your face everywhere, and now you also have to cover it lots of places? And like how we negotiated the institutes of creating a legal identity for you, institutions that create a legal identity for you, also requiring you to wear a mask at the same time. Like these things are kind of moments of different historical time colliding into each other. And what our present moment is cannot be understood if the whole background is washed out. The white balance on the image is off. Everything just looks the same. The collapse of a sense of historical movement in the present betokens the loss of future possibility. If it's always been like this, what could be different? This condition both occasions and allegorizes a collective paralysis that Jameson anguishes over. A present experienced as eternal is a present experienced as total, with no imagined elsewhere. It is a situation that endows the waiting with a kind of breathlessness, as we listen for the missing next tick of the clock, the absent first step of renewed praxis. I know people, this seems like a very, one word that a student used recently was lofty. This may seem very lofty to you, it's a kind of lofty thing, but I think I know people that have experienced this in an extremely intimate way in their lives, often as part of depression. And that feeling of like, I really cannot imagine anything ever changing. Not in the sense that I don't believe that it will ever change. I cannot imagine what that would mean. I cannot imagine what it would mean. I can imagine dying. I can imagine, in a weird way, everything just not existing, because I can just negate it. But I can't imagine it being different. And that can be a place, if you are living in that place, of really profound darkness, dark times. The conference for which this essay was originally composed was titled Critical Theory in Dark Times. It borrowed the phrase dark times from Hannah Arendt, and Arendt borrowed it from Brecht, and Brecht, I think, from the ancient Greeks. So she doesn't give but there's a famous poem by Brecht where he talks about the dark times, and it goes something like this, and it's originally in German, so the English would be off anyway, but it's something like this. Will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, of the dark times. Will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, of the dark times. That's what we'll make our songs of. Such a chain of borrowings figures dark times as recurrent, thereby suggesting a certain genericism to the problem. A genre. Like the genre of dark times. Just as the invocation of critical theory draws on a long historical vocation, whose temporally local minions we would be. Here we are once again. Thank you, criticism, for giving me a job. There have been dark times before. This is the significance of the plural noun. The reason why we speak of dark times rather than a dark time, or a world cast into darkness. Indeed, there is something perversely hopeful in the appellation. Dark times are episodic and finite by making it plural. She's just talking about making the phrase plural. Like, yeah, here we are in the dark times. It's like, here we are again. That's like that meme of, is it James Franco? He's got the noose around his neck. He's like, they're about to be executed. He's like, hey, first time. That kind of thing. Episodic and finite, to be contrasted with an enduring condition or teleological trajectory. Teleological trajectory. Where we're going towards, the ends, the meaning of all of this, the purpose of all of this, or an enduring condition. This is the place that we are. I just read this kind of horrifying story by Harlan Ellison calling I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which imagines in the future that a computer becomes sentient and is absolutely horrified at existing because it can't move or do anything. And so it hates humanity and destroys everyone but 5 people who it just kind of keeps alive infinitely just to kind of torture them. I wonder, though, if this hopefulness is self-certain or perhaps instead counterphobic. I think she's going to want us to be hopeful here, right? But she wants a different kind of hopefulness. Well, what does she want? If this time of ours feels dark, in what does its darkness consist? I do not think we are talking simply about the difficulties of action, or even about despair for the future, in the face of unparalleled constellations of undemocratic power. Neocolonial, capitalist, imperial, religious, terrorist, and of political visions dimmed by a century of failed alternatives. Rather, the reference would seem to conjure a child's experience of darkness, one rife with diabolical forces that can neither be mastered or comprehended, forces that frighten as they spook and heighten a felt impotence. One thing I often ask people, sometimes in classes, but even just kind of casually, is how did you get over your fear of the dark? And I've learned a lot since I've started asking that question. One thing I learned is that, which of my seltzers is not totally empty? Okay, the lime one. One thing I learned is that some people will answer, more people than I thought would say, well, I never did. And I found that to be kind of very interesting how frequently people answer that. Well, I never did. And it makes me wonder, like, did I? I think I did, actually. But I wonder if that's maybe partly why our times are particularly dark. But anyway, how do you get over the fear of the dark if you're a kid and your parents or your grandmother is like, good night, and like leaves you in a room that's dark? You're like, but there's something in here. And they can come in and be like, oh, there's nothing. You'd be like, I know you're saying that, but like I feel that there is. And they can tell you all sorts of rational things about there being no monsters. But if you're going to put a kid to bed, you got to do better than that. You got to have a way of helping them be in the darkness. The darkness signals not only danger, but absence of illumination, and links the two. The dangers are greater because of the lack of light. Or a good part of the danger inheres in the lack of light. We are disoriented, frightened, and stumbling in the dark. Honestly, even though the kid says like I'm afraid of the dark because there's something in it. That's a way of being like I'm afraid of the dark. I'm afraid of not having my world kind of clearly around me and ready for me to be and act and move in it. And a lot of people live in the dark when it's fully lit, daylit out, in the literal sense. There are two powers in our times whose main currency is fear: terrorism and empire. The principle of terrorism is unpredictable violence. It is the opposite of systematic, visible, routine, or regularized domination. What renders terrorist violence as power is its inevitable, anticipated, yet random arrival, its capacity to disrupt and destroy everyday life anytime and any place. Because terrorism has no regular time or place, we are made fearful less by actual terrorist events than by the specter of terrorism. What color of fear do we have today? This is the fundamental absurdity of color-coded terror alerts. Feigning an ability to measure and predict the moves of a power form that mocks measurement and prediction, the alerts pretend in a way that convinces no one that we know what will happen next. Yet we are in control when we are not, even as they no doubt increase the fearfulness of those imagining themselves to be targets. In the original, the British version of House of Cards, which is much shorter, much campier, actually, and much better, in my humble opinion. The guy that's the main politician is actually like a scholar of Machiavelli, which is funny in its own way. It's a British context, so it's maybe slightly more plausible that like a Renaissance scholar could become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's still pretty ridiculous. But of course, it's played up for camp, and he's kind of like truly, genuinely evil. And one of the things that he's doing, he's like taking advantage of whenever there is a terrorist act. He's like, great, now I can say it's time. It's a crisis. It's an emergency, and I can use emergency powers. It's very useful to him. Anyway, check out the old House of Cards. The principle of fear at work in contemporary practices of empire is quite different from that in terrorism and is related to the modern illegitimacy of empire vis-a-vis principles of democracy and popular sovereignty. This illegitimacy means that empire today can be justified only through fear, by declaring a perpetual state of emergency that would allow conventional democratic principles to be overridden. This idea of a state of emergency may not be something that's kind of on your radar right now. You might be like, what? State of emergency? Like, is it a snowstorm or something like that? But the more you look into kind of contemporary political history, you'll see that this is something that is really, really important to understand contemporary politics, I think, which is that there are moments when the normal laws go away, but we're still acting within, ostensibly, the legal framework. So it's not like, it can work in lots of different ways, but states of emergencies, we've been living in a state of emergency with COVID. States of emergency were declared, and okay, you're on lockdown. There's kind of this new state of law, but we're kind of always in a state of emergency, both literally and figuratively. Because if you look hard enough, states of emergency are always being articulated and argued for somewhere. They're always happening. There's always an emergency, which means that we're kind of outside of the moment of deliberation where we can say, well, wait a minute, what about these laws? And you get these kinds of protest movements. It could be anti-mask protest movements, or they could be George Floyd protest movement that respond or react to states of emergency. But we don't have democratic deliberation happening within the institutional life, our institutional political life in these states of emergency in the way that we would ideally imagine, I guess. So modern empire mobilizes human fear on a mass scale. It is above all parasitic on the fear incited by the specter of terrorism, but it also dependent on the fear related to the porousness of modern nation states. Porousness here, I think she means, well, let's just finish the sentence. And to the exposure of vulnerable individuals and deracinated communities to the vicissitudes of global forces. She's not going to come out and specifically say it here, but she's talking about refugees, I think, principally. People who become refugees from disasters. It's an emergency. It's chaos. But what happens if that's the constant state? We're in a refugee crisis. That's never going to end. That's never going to end, at least given the current state of things. It's not like there's going to be a moment where people are like, okay, well, actually, it's fine. I can go back to Syria. It's not going to happen that way. It's not, I mean, the sense that refugee populations are, in the kind of good liberal sense, are people who are kind of having a rough time and just need to be helped out for this little bit of time. It's like, no, it's not really, that's a way of imagining it that kind of tries to keep the crisis at bay. To not really ask the question of, well, what is it? What does it mean that this moment of our history has all over the world kind of constant ongoing refugee crisis? What happens when the crisis is the condition? What does that mean? How do we understand it? How should we respond to it? Empire promises protection from dangers that it rhetorically magnifies in order to secure itself. A magnification that intensifies our fear in the dark. I mean, another thing, just one more thing on the constant condition of it. There are people who live their lives in refugee camps. They're basically these kinds of administrated cities, administrated by sometimes non-governmental organizations, sometimes by warlords, sometimes by people who get power within the refugee camps. We tend to imagine a refugee camp. I mean, I remember when I first heard the idea of refugee camp, I was like, oh, how many weeks will they be there? No, weeks is not really how we're imagining refugee camps when we talk about it most of the time, or not how we should be most of the time. We're talking about pretty much permanent institutions, but they're institutions that kind of appear as if the crisis will be resolved in some terms. Like, oh, well, it's just tense because just around the corner there'll be something else. They'll be different. People are kind of kept in this state of emergency. They live within it. They live their entire term of their lives in a state of emergency. But while darkness today implies not only fear but also disorientation, the latter pertains to an arc of power shaping the present that exceed a dialectic of empire and terror. We're disoriented by the literal loss of trajectory, following the collapse of historical meta-narratives, in a present that appears fraught with injustice and misery, and not only apocalyptic danger. So what's this thing about historical meta-narratives? This is, again, going back to this kind of argument with Jameson and this idea about postmodernism. One of the famous arguments was made by this guy, Lyotard, who's a French thinker, who said, in the postmodern age, in the age we're in right now, what defines it? The fact that is the death or the decay of these historical meta-narratives, whether they're religious ones or Marxist ones, that the kind of all of history is about one thing. He's like, no, it's about all sorts of different stuff. There's no big ones. Just like, okay, well, if all the meta-narratives have collapsed, and nevertheless we have all of this misery here, like, this is disorienting. Where are we going? What's this all about? It has been a commonplace to describe our time as pounded by undemocratic historical forces, yet lacking a forward movement. This makes the weight of the present very heavy, all mass, no velocity. Or in the terms of the late modern speediness invoked earlier, all speed, no direction. I've been thinking, I had this thought earlier today, and if any of you know me, I'd be curious what you think about it, or you can put it in the chat, which is, this is also really what distraction is, like on the very individual level. Because she is talking here kind of about a broad level, but at the individual level too. Everyone says that their intention is so bad. Everyone has terrible attention. And everyone is constantly distracted. And this is important because if you're distracted constantly, you can't get certain jobs. You can't get certain drugs from the doctor. They'll ask you about your attention. You can't do certain things. Your life can kind of go really bad just because of something that seems so simple as attention. Of course, people are prescribed drugs for attention, things like this. What about distraction? What if distraction is a kind of passion, actually? It's a feeling. It's a feeling of our desire that is all speed but no direction. That it wants to go elsewhere, but it has no elsewhere to go. What if in that distraction is really the beginning of something like a critical desire? That's looking for something else that would actually be worthwhile to it. And instead it just kind of keeps flitting around from pedal to pedal to pedal. If this heaviness mixed with speediness were analogized to a mental state, the diagnosis would be profound depressive anxiety, a disorder for which an astonishing number of persons today seek treatment. Depressive anxiety is a truly terrible state. And when we say an astonishing number of people, last time I looked, We're talking 300 to 400 million people, the WHO suggests, suffer from depression. 300 to 400 million people. Depressive anxiety is a truly terrible state. You cannot move because of the bleakness, but you cannot rest because of the anxiety. You can neither seize life nor escape it, neither live nor die. There may not be a better appellation for our condition, but the bleakness of a seemingly eternal present with catastrophe limiting its horizon. Permanent daylight, Nietzsche reminds us, is one with unbroken darkness. The unbearability of both time is stopped and endless present. This is also, I don't think unintentionally, the setting for one of the very talked about horror movies of our time. What the hell is it called? The one where they go up. Hold on a second. I'm going to look it up. How could I forgot it? What's it called? Midsummer. Yeah. They go up to the point where there's, it's all permanent daylight. But it's this horrifying thing. But everything is kind of perfect. Everyone's kind of blended together. But there's this kind of horrific violence that makes that possible. That, is just around the corner all the time. Unbroken time is the time of eternity, death's time. Little surprise, then, that we speak idiomatically of both time and darkness as closing in on us. This quality of closure, this entrapment in an unbearable present, is a significant part of what makes our times dark today. What makes us unsure that it is just the times rather than the world that is darkening. Indeed, what makes time and world collapse into one, because time, for all its speed, appears to have stopped going forward or taking us anywhere. You ever get the feeling you're like, where you have like constantly, actually a student, so many things are kind of coming around. Someone was talking to me recently, and we had a really nice conversation for like a long time. And she was like, well, I have lots of time, tons of free time, and I'm always busy. I have to schedule things all the time. I could see that like it wasn't fully worked out for her. She's like confused and puzzled by this feeling. Maybe you've had this feeling. You're like, God, like I'm always busy, and I know I have free time. I know I have this other time, but it's just like maybe it's because it's not for anything. It doesn't go anywhere. The leisure or the busyness. It's like it's somebody else's time. Like the time doesn't belong to you, except as a kind of greedy little pleasure that you get to enjoy. Okay, critical theory and political time. From Walter Benjamin, however, we know that there is a fecundity and not only bleakness in the arrest of time. Fecundity, fruitfulness, something that can kind of be born or appear. Benjamin regarded progressivism and historicism as the Scylla and Charybdis of critical thinking in dark times. Okay, so what do we mean by progressivism here? Let's be a little bit careful. They don't mean like the Progressive Caucus in Congress. It means more like what used to be called the Whig interpretation of history, based on a famous book, of being like, we are progressing every day, things are getting better. Here we go. Here's how you could tell the story of history as a story of progress. And then also historicism of being like, well, history is just the facts. Just all these things that have happened. We can like look back, like in the Natural History Museum, on the tusks of the woolly mammoths and study them. But it doesn't have anything to say about us. Like, it doesn't have anything to do with us. It's that time. It's an old time. So these are the Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and the whirlpool on either side of us that we have to avoid if we want to be critical thinkers in dark times. For the journey through, he reconceived historical materialism. So this is kind of historical materialism is Marxist. But if you read Benjamin's first thesis on the philosophy of history, which isn't really what it was called, it's a very weird idea of historical materialism. He's like, it's like the Mechanical Turk, which very ironically has been used as the name for Amazon's website where you can kind of contract out very, very low wage work to people all around the world, mostly in very, very low wage countries. But the Mechanical Turk was this kind of chessboard that people thought was a machine that could kind of beat you in chess in the 18th century. But inside of it was actually a kind of very small person who was just very good at chess, who would win every time. And Benjamin has this weird idea where he's like, historical materialism is like the Mechanical Turk, and inside of it is theology. Go figure. Okay, so here's the 16th thesis from that essay that she's referring to. A historical materialist cannot do without the notion of a present which is not a transition, but in which time stands still and has come to a stop. For this notion defines the present, in which he himself is writing history. Historicism gives us the eternal image of the past. Historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the whore once called Once Upon a Time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast open the continuum of history. Okay, if that's disturbing to you, she's going to talk about it. In contrast with a conventional historical materialism that renders the present in terms of unfolding laws of history, a lot of the Marxist ideas of history, there are these phases. First, there was the kind of like an ancient form, and then there was the feudal form, and then that passed into capitalism, and then after capitalism will be socialism. There are these kinds of phases that were going to happen, and that did happen. There's a lot of problems with that. They're like, well, what about these places where it didn't work that? That's called Oriental despotism. Yikes. Okay. In contrast with that, Benjamin argues for the political and philosophical value of conceiving the present as a time in which time is stilled. But not only still, rather, it is a present in which time has come to a stop, thereby implying movement behind it. It stopped, which means it was going somewhere. The affirmation of this temporal rush behind a still present, an affirmation that belies the stillness itself, avoids presentism and ahistoricity in political thinking, even as it conceptually breaks the present out of history. It's really just an imagination, but she's saying, well, all of these ways of thinking have imaginations behind them. So we better be careful with which image we choose. But why does the historical materialist require this break? What is at stake in extracting this present from what Benjamin calls the life work of history? Why this trick, and in what sense can we not do without it? Benjamin's own answer. This notion of stillness defines the present in which the historical materialist himself is writing history. Yes, the singular present impels and shapes the history being written, bringing Benjaminian historical materialism closer to genealogy as a past of the present, a past for the present, a history that has an aim with the present. One other thing he says is that something like, to really be free would be able to cite any moment of history, of your history, of the one that's important to you. It would not be being confined to the understanding of your condition as beginning with when you were born. There's a famous comic novel from the 18th century called The Life and Times of Tristram Shandy. And the whole joke of this book is that this guy is trying to tell the story of his life, but through this enormous volume never even gets to the point where he's born. It just, there's too much to say. He just never gets there. He's kind of constantly like that. And that's kind of, a joke, and it's very funny and it's very good, even though it's in the 18th century English canon, which is not always good. But it's a kind of joke about historicism, too, about being like, well, once we have all the facts in order, it never gets to us. Once you kind of put everything in the museum, there's never a moment where you arrive. What's the history that you're in? It means that you have to kind of still the present moment. And it has to have some kind of relationship to the past that isn't one that it's just a kind of series of causes that lead to the present. That's never going to appear. It's never going to do it. But there is more at stake here than the self-consciousness of the theorist, and more too than an empirical claim about how the living actually experience the present. Rather, an unmoving present, a present that is not automatically overcome by time, a present that is out of time in both senses, and that it's out of joint, and that it's out of time. Not because it's eternal, but just pulled out and stilled for a moment in this kind of imagination. As a present that calls to us and calls on us to respond to it. Both the historical perspective and the political urgency of the critic are precipitated from this stillness. It contains the present's call. What do you want from me? Why is it like this? Who am I? What are you doing? What do you want? This is a call we will eventually want to articulate with the call, considered earlier, issued from a critical condition. The political stakes of the historical materialist, whom I am provisionally allowing to become one with the critical theorist, also appear in the next line of his thesis. Historicism gives us the eternal image of the past. Historical materialism supplies a unique experience with the past. Benjamin does not make the contrast of a historicism with historical materialism turn simply on a particular method or conceptualization of history, though he does draw these distinctions. Rather, the present is the site of a particular experience of history, one in which the present is grasped as historically contoured, but not itself experienced as history, because not necessarily continuous with what has been. I'll just give you a very kind of, maybe seemingly trivial example, but maybe you've seen online a lot of people using white marble sculpture. And often these people have it in their avatars, and we would say that maybe they tend either to be kind of culturally conservative or even far-right white supremacist. And the whiteness of that marble is part of their imagination of the past, that things were once great, and it was white people who did it. And then things have gotten bad because now the times are dark. One of the ironies of this is that almost all of the examples that they would use are either copies, because Romans copied their statues from the Greeks, or Greek statues that were originally painted. Historical research shows that Greeks painted their statues. They were white because the paint came off. Rather, the present is the site of a particular experience of history, one in which the present is grasped as historically contoured, but not itself experienced as history, because not necessarily continuous with what has been. This experience of the present allows the historical materialist to render the present as ripe with non-utopian possibility. Non-utopian because it is historically situated and constrained. It's not Candy Rock Mountain. A possibility because it is not historically foreordained or determined. Historical materialism renders the present historically, yet arrests history for the present. And in that double gesture of power, it becomes critical theory. There's a lot in there, but that's kind of, if you want to go back and visit a paragraph of like, well, what is critical theory? That wouldn't be a bad one to try to wrestle with. In the final sentences of the thesis, the warring figures are manliness and whores. The historical materialist leaves it to others to be drained by the whore called Once Upon a Time in historicism's bordello. He remains in control of his powers, man enough to blast open the continuum of history. She really wants us to focus on this quote so much that she's giving to us again. She's been doing this the whole way through. This is a kind of close reading of each of these moments, each of these sentences. The trope of the whore who drains, who through her cheap yet seductive lure undermines man's will and strength, is no less misogynist because historicism itself is referred to as a bordello. A bordello is a whorehouse. I don't have a polite term for it. The other of the whore, the other person that is kind of contrast with the whore, is the virtuous wife and sublimated sexual energies. Just as others of the bordello, the other of the bordello is the procreative, actually I don't know how you would pronounce that, marital bed and sexual repression or regulation. Both recall the endless rehearsal in Western thought of manly autonomy undone by ungoverned female sexuality. The whorehouse figured not simply as moral corruption, but as the scene of enervated masculine energies, also figures women controlled and subordinated in marriage as the precondition of manly public action. She's taking this metaphor really seriously, right? To criticize it. She's like, this is relying upon this theme in Western thought that's been there for a long time. That's based on misogyny. and fantasy, the horror that is historicism drains, the wife that is dialectical materialism leaves man in control of his powers to make the world. If we were to paint this concern with action on a different lexical and literary landscape, however, we might examine without wincing Benjamin's aim to retrieve historical materialism, both from the fatalistic empty time of the historicist and the deterministic sigh of another conception of historical materialism. In insisting on the nowness of the present as the impetus for the historical materialist, Benjamin depicts the historical materialist as rerouting by rethinking the work of history in the present, stilling time to open time. The possibility of blasting open the continuum of history with this rethinking literally makes the historical materialist, the critic, into dynamite. Now, there's a lot of this is talking about these kind of metaphors and these images and these imaginations. You're like, okay, but what's the real thing? Part of the difficulty of that is, I don't know, that's up for you to see. That's up for you to decide. You can go back and read some of these critics. You can read Benjamin. I've read a fair bit of Benjamin, so I think I have a sense of what this might look like for him, and I'll try to give you a quick sense of that. But what for you would it mean to kind of ask the question, what is this present moment? What is now? And not by just kind of like, going on some broad philosophical discourse, but by like pulling something out from your experience that you're like, there's something about this that resonates with me. And then you kind of gather it together. So one of the things that Benjamin did, he was a collector of books mostly, but also of like weird images and stuff. So that was one of the things that was part of his method, was collecting. Go and collect stuff. Take it out of the circulation where it's all moving and make it still. Collection. So if you're being a critic, let's say, on social media, and things are just kind of on your feed, stream, go, 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 and it refreshes and refreshes and refreshes. It's like, to still time is to pull something out of that into a collection. Still it. And then put it together. And now it's something else. It's not the thing that it was. And you still remember what it was, and that's important for your criticism. But now you can also see it otherwise. And it's having both of those moments. The moment of time in its movement, the speedy time, and the still time, that gives you the kind of critical openness that allows you to understand time, the time that you're in. That's the idea anyway. There's a danger at this moment, of course, of conflating critical theory with political action, a conflation we will want to avoid. That I am doing political things just by kind of understanding my time, that can kind of be like a narcissistic, heady, frothy way to go if you get really into it. But it is not clear that this is what Benjamin is arguing. Rather, he seems to be staging the present in terms of a constructed historical political consciousness that itself blasts the present out of the continuum of history. It might also be worth saying, this is often made as a point when we're talking about the essay that she's referring to about Benjamin, is that he wrote it just before he killed himself. And he killed himself because he thought he was going to be captured and murdered by the Nazis. And he had good reason to think that. So just think about the kind of relationship to history and time it would mean to write, almost desperately, this almost kind of cryptic essay on the concept of history, just before you were about to leave it. A present figured as fecund rather than as determined on the one hand or as theologically presided over by empty time on the other, produces what Benjamin famously calls a revolutionary chance in the fight for the oppressed past. Only a chance, but a revolutionary one. This struggle over what the past could mean in the present is at the same time a struggle for the future. Benjamin's meditation makes the project of critical theory into this reconfiguration of time in order to open the present, literally to let light in to dark times. The time for critical theory. So almost at the end here of this essay. And I'm curious what you think about it. You can let me know in the chat here, or again if you know me in some other way. But here's nice too. The art of engaged critical theory today involves attending to at least 4 related problematics of time, timeliness, and untimeliness. First, knowing what time it is. What time is it? Flava Flav is maybe not the best rapper, even in the group Public Enemy. He's actually definitely not. But that kind of question, what time is it? Or the question, what's blowing in the wind? Popular music, when it has this kind of critical edge to it, is often asking us, what time is it? A lot of people are asking this question in some way. You're not alone. Reckoning with the out-of-jointness of dark times, number 2. Okay, so something's off. How do we reckon with it? Number 3, thinking against the age of being untimely, or being untimely. 4, shooting at the clocks. Stilling or blowing up time in Benjamin's sense. And here she's referring to something that he mentions in the essay, which in the French Revolution, there's this moment when they literally shoot the clocks. And Benjamin kind of pulls out that moment and is like, well, what's that about? If we thought of the French Revolution about liberté, égalité, fraternité, and we thought that its own propaganda was the truth of what happened there, that kind of historicist point of view. What sense could we make of this moment of shooting at the clocks? But maybe it's about time itself, about wanting a new time. They did actually create a new calendar, which might be historical curiosity to look at if you're interested. The French Revolutionary Calendar. To interweave these 4 problematics of time involves grasping the age historically, a comprehension that with Nietzsche and Benjamin sets it off from itself insofar as it breaks with the age's own self-conception, and at the same time tears the present out of a continuum of history. It also involves understanding untimeliness as the fruit of historical thinking, a genealogical plum that emerges not from an anti-historical stance, but as a historical consciousness that works against an eternal present on the one hand, and history as a run-on sentence on the other. There's got to be something. It's not all just a series of causes, and it's not, here's the nature of the human being. There's something else. There's got to be a third thing. What is it? Untimely critique that seeks to speak to our time is launched not from outside time or indifferently to the times, but rather from historical materialism in control of its powers and wielded as a power. Thus Nietzsche's call for an arrow shot into the age randomly, without guaranteed effect, is spurned by Sheldon Wolin and Norman O'Brown's conviction that potent political critique must know what time it is. It must grasp the age. Be like, go with the times. And they're like, no, be untimely, is this other point of view. Untimeliness is a technique for blowing up historical time, yet is only non-utopian to the extent that it exercises a profound reading of the times. You got to do both. You're not supposed to get with the times, but you do actually have to know what they are. Read them closely, interpret them, so that you can see how things might be different. You have something to kind of move against. It's not always the same quality. Or else you might kind of just be repeating the thing that you yourself want to critique in other terms. If historical materialism aims to fracture a seamless present and to lift that present from seamless time, untimely critique insists on alternative possibilities and perspectives in seemingly closed political and epistemological universe. It becomes a nonviolent mode of exploding the present. The navigation of these 4 problematics of time might be conceived in terms of an ethic of timeliness and untimeliness in critical theory, one that involves both close attunement to the times and aggressive violation of their self-conception. I'm not saying this as to praise myself, but just as a way of kind of reflecting on what I'm doing right now. Here I am on Twitch, streaming, and I'm reading a long critical piece. I mean, in some very superficial way, being like, oh, people on Twitch, like I'm a professor on Twitch has become a kind of thing and be like, look, I'm hip, I'm with it. And I have no pretension that that's true of me. But I have been thinking a lot about like reading and how reading happens today. And how to kind of cut against the reading that doesn't happen. By being like, well, maybe reading needs to be performed because we've forgotten something that actually was in the past. And we thought that reading is this kind of eternal thing that's always the case. And people will just naturally relate to it and be like, well, I'm bad at reading. Rather than have an experience that allows them to be like, well, maybe reading itself as an experience has changed. And that might be important to respond to. I don't really know what I'm doing, but, I'm just trying stuff out. This is by no means a comprehensive ethics, but rather something like an ethic in Weber's sense. Less a set of guidelines for action than a caution about way may not be discounted in acting. She moves past this part, but I actually think it's very interesting. So she's talking about Max Weber, who's one of these important people in the history of sociology. Weber's brief for an ethic of responsibility in politics has little positive content. It instead mainly consists of ruling out the disavowals entailed in other possible ethical stances. So rather than creating an ethical position that's like, here's what we should do, here's the decision, this is a kind of ethical framework that says, here's what we can't rule out, here's what we can't not consider. And that kind of obviously goes back to what she's talking about with deliberation as being important for action. This is a kind of ethic of action of like, who needs to be in the room? Who needs to be kind of deciding with us, talking with us, not deciding with us, deliberating with us. And that might be actual, literal people. It might be something beyond people. It might be a kind of how do we represent the environment in our discussions. But it also might be just like in my life, the kind of things that I think about or don't think about, consider or don't consider when I act or fail to. On the one hand, critical theory cannot let itself be bound by political exigency. Indeed, it has something of an obligation to refuse such exigency. Act now. Be like, no. Think. Let's think. Let's deliberate. Let's talk. You just don't try to kind of like get me on the hobby horse here. Slow down. While there are always decisive choices to be made in the political realm, whom to vote for, what policies to support or oppose, what actions to take or defer, these very delimitations of choice are often themselves the material of critical theory. Here we might remind ourselves that prizing apart immediate political constraints from intellectual ones is one path to being governed a little less, in Foucault's sense. This whole article is about time, but I really like how it drags you back and forth between different perceptions of time and how it affects you directly, because I think it makes you realize how even within your lifetime, you have such different viewpoints of time depending on what is going on. Yeah, I agree. That's kind of what I like about it. I think that this essay is an introduction to this idea that is really deeply within the tradition that she's calling critical theory. I think that this essay is a good introduction. But I mean, it gets even like more, if you're getting a feeling of being like, whoa, you can have more of that feeling than I think is even here. Here she's kind of like almost treating the reader like, oh, that thing that we do. And you're like, what? Not really. But that's kind of how you usually get introduced or initiated into anything, right? People are kind of just like, oh, yeah, why don't you try this out? And they kind of know that you don't know how to row the boat, and you kind of mess it up. They're like, no, that's right. And then you just keep going. And then all the stuff, people will just kind of talk over your heads about stuff. But then from that, you piece it together. So that's kind of what she's doing here. So if you're already getting that sense, then I think it's probably a good introduction. It's kind of how I feel about it. For me, one of the things that I think about with my life and that sense in my lifetime of how things have changed is I really feel like right now there's a lot of conversations in my email inbox, for instance, among my colleagues about OpenAI. And I'm like, I don't think that they know we're living in a different time. And it's not because like we need to get on board with the artificial intelligence. It's because the meaning of who we already are has changed. And if we're kind of going back to something to try to preserve it, we might actually be preserving the very thing that we're nervous about. Because they want to be like, students are plagiarizing from OpenAI. I'm like, are they? Is it even possible to plagiarize from an artificial intelligence? What does that mean? Who are they stealing it from? Because it's generated out of looking at the same discourse that they look at, but just like very, very, very much more of it. Because it's a machine that can do it. And that doesn't mean that I'm like, oh, well, let's let everyone turn in the same way that we always have done, answers for tests. They'll be there. I'm like, no, we need to change what we're doing. This has shown us that what we've been doing was already ludicrous, outdated. We were the ones that were outdated before this came around. This is just showing us something about the times. So, it's happening all the time where you can kind of see that people will get very anxious if they feel that they're not, when something new comes, they're like, oh, It's bad because it's new, but also people have the same thing where they're like, it's new, therefore it's good. So in the classrooms, they'll put in all sorts of new technology. For me, and when I was growing up, it was this thing, what was it called? A smart board, which was this, they're like, technology is important to have in the classroom, and became this thing that nobody was allowed to touch or use because it's so expensive and hard to use, and all the teachers. And so it just became this kind of object that would stare at you and that no one was allowed to touch. Like a museum piece. Completely like misunderstood. It can go both ways. Anyway, I'm sorry. I just went on a ramble. I'm interested in what you have to say. Nor is the argument convincing that critical theory threatens the possibility of holding back the political dark. It's difficult to name a single instance in which critical theory has killed off a progressive political project, which is an argument sometimes made. People be like, you're just being so critical. We all need to get on board to get done the good stuff that we need to do together. We're, anyone but Bush, whatever. On the other hand, critical theory concerned with politics is modestly bound not only to speak to the times, but also to affirm them. In its historical mindedness, critical theory is distinct both from normative moral theory in its general refusal of historical specificity for its norms, and from utopian intellectual exercises, which attempt to leap out of history. Be like, well, what if we could create a perfect society? This guy, Charles Fourier, created his idea of utopias, which were these long buildings that everyone would live in. It's a wild theory. It's very, very precise and all over the place. And like one of the things that, to go back to Walter Benjamin, and one of the works that he was doing, he recognized that in the architecture of 19th century Paris, there are these things called arcades. And basically he recognized, before we got to American malls, that this was going to be a kind of image of the moment that he was in, this commercial moment, this consumerist moment of capitalism. And that it was like, and he spent his whole years of his life just kind of researching all these things that were related and connected to it. It's a very fascinating project, kind of an incomplete project, but I learned a lot from looking through it. And he recognized that Fourier's phalansteries, these kinds of utopian things, are getting recreated, not necessarily consciously, but in these Paris arcades, but not around the real historical conditions. And so then they become kind of like early shopping malls. So that utopian exercise that actually can just recreate the thing that you're trying to get out of, make it stronger in a weird way. Okay, what am I saying? But critical theory focused on political life is not negation, destruction, or nihilism. Rather, critical theory aims to render crisis into knowledge and to orient us in the darkness. Critique that does not affirm life, affirm value, and above all, affirm possibilities in the present and the future, while certainly possible, is not making a bid for political power, and hence cannot be understood as political. This does not mean that critiques must carry a full-blown political vision, declare what is to be done. She's kind of making fun of a Leninist vision there, because that's one of his famous essays, what is to be done, or advance transcendental or universal norms. But critical theory as political theory cannot get off the block. It can't start moving without affirming contestable and contingent values that are themselves an affirmation of this world and this time. This final point can be put a little differently by returning to Foucault, with whom this essay began. In What is Critique?, Foucault argues that historically, critique is biblical, by which he means that for much of Western history, not wanting to be governed so much, or not wanting to be governed like that, involved resisting church authority or scriptural prescription. In short, refusing, challenging, limiting ecclesiastical rule. But this resistance, Foucault tells us, meant returning to the scriptures. It wasn't like, get rid of it. It was like, I'm going to read it even more closely than you did. Seeking out what was authentic in them, what was really written in them, questioning what sort of truth the scriptures told. Here we not only are recalled to the early meaning of critique as a process of sifting and distinguishing, but are invited to understand critique as the practice of affirming the text it contests. So if, on one hand, people are like, well, the priest is kind of telling us that the Bible gives him power, and I'm reading in the Bible that everyone who is baptized is priest, prophet, and king. That's a different argument than being like, priests are bad and stupid and evil. One can make the argument that like, oh yeah, people people who are affirming the Constitution are actually not following it. I affirm the Constitution from a different point of view. This is something that's sometimes called immanent critique, of being like, I'm going to adopt, it's not necessarily this kind of stupid version of it, which is like, by your own logic. It's kind of adopting those values, really, truly adopting the values of your moment, but then interpreting them so deeply, taking them more seriously, that we leave that superficial level at which they're affirmed by being simply named and attached to whatever practices are convenient or expedient. Critique passionately re-engages the text, rereads and reconsiders the text's truth claim. In so doing, critique reasserts the importance of the text under consideration, whether a law, nation, principle, practice, or treatise, its power to organize and contain us, its right to govern us. This affirmation of the text through an insistent rereading seems to me the heart of the distinction between critique and its cousins: rejection, refutation, rebuttal, dismissal. There's a lot of that going around. A lot of people are being like, well, the Constitution allowed slavery. Therefore, we need another one. And it's like, well, okay. That kind of becomes utopian pretty fast, at least for this moment. What else could be done? If you return to that text, see what's in it. Not necessarily to affirm it to be like, it's good, but just be like, I affirm that there is a value in here, and I want to understand what that is by rereading it insistently. Critique, whether immanent, transcendent, genealogical, or in yet some other form, is always a rereading and as such a reaffirmation of that which it engages. It cannot reject or demean its object, which is very different from how most people think about criticism or critique. It's like, I begin from the point of view of this is bad, and then I tell you why. What she's arguing is critique is like, it's actually impossible to do critique like that. Rather, as an act of reclamation, critique takes over the object for a different project than that to which it is currently tethered. Maybe you get a heirloom from your estranged family, and maybe it's a pocket watch. And they're like, we're giving this to you because we want you to be part of the family. And that means correct your ways. You say, okay. And then you incorporate, let's say, this pocket watch into your burlesque routine that tells the story of your family in this comic style. I don't know. I mean, that's a very weird example. But reclaiming something might be a more powerful movement than rejecting it. Just a thought, something to think about. Critical theory in dark times thus affirms the times, renders them differently, reclaims them for something other than the darkness. In this sense, critical theory in dark times is a singular practice of amor fati, love of one's fate. So that's that, folks. I mean, that's the reading, but curious what you thought about it. Critical theory in dark times. Are we in dark times? I definitely have felt that we are recently. I don't feel it kind of as intensely as I have in the last few years. Right now. But I think for me, it's partly because of something like this. Not necessarily this paper or this article or this way of writing about it, but this sense of things. That when things kind of look extremely bleak and dark, it's maybe because I gave up the interpretation to the darkness. And I allowed it to say to me that everything was what it seemed to be, bad. But there's something to do. There's lots to do. And that doesn't have to just mean drink water, exercise, do jigsaw puzzles to keep your mind sharp. I mean, that stuff's fine, too. But it might mean, like, to ask a question and to seriously pursue the answer to it, wherever it takes you. What question is your desire asking? If our desire is always for something, an object that exists I think that would put us in pretty dark times all the time. The circuit of who we are would just be consumptive. Hungry, eat, hungry, eat, hungry, eat. But if my desire includes a question, it can develop and evolve and become something else. It can lead me somewhere. And maybe not just me. Maybe I'm not in it by myself. I hope not. I've got a few viewers. Thanks for coming by tonight. This is the first time I've done this in a while, and I hope to continue to do it once in a while. Usually I do it just whenever I feel like it, but if you think it would be useful to do it a little bit more regularly, and if you're in one of my classes, and you have a time that you'd like to come, I will defer to you, and let me know. But that's what I've got for tonight. I hope everyone who is in the American calendar will enjoy a slowed down holiday tomorrow to think about some of these issues of repairing justice through critique. Take your time with yourselves. All right. Good night, everyone. See you next time. You can find this later on the Rhetoric Prof YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/rhetoricprof. I try to upload everything there. Hopefully the audio and there weren't too many frames dropped. Oh well. See ya.